Hello and welcome back once again. This is Victor Magariño, and today we're going to continue the discussion I started previously about inequality from a Marxist perspective. So to begin with, I want to make sure that we're all in the same page. So I've decided to present once again the outline in order to see both what we have already covered as well as what we're going to be covering today. So we began last video by describing economic inequality and the different measurements that there are for it. We said that there's two main measurements of inequality that we are focused in, which are income and wealth. And we also said that there is different manners in which economic inequality manifests itself, including between groups, between individuals, between ethnicities, etc. We also saw two different approaches to inequality, the first being the naturalist approach, which is the one that we criticized for being simplistic and not taking into consideration the social component of inequality in our current world. And we defended the Marxist explanation of inequality, which takes into consideration the economic structure of the capitalist societies that we are trying to study. We saw the empirical evidence that suggests that our theory is in fact correct, and we saw how those societies where the proletariat has more bargaining power and better representation in parliament and in worker unions are the same countries that score better in terms of inequality. We also saw that even in the United States, in different periods of time where the proletariat had different conditions of power, their outcomes were also quite different. And thus, the moments where the proletariat had less representation, like nowadays, are the moment in US history where the capitalist class owns more wealth, owns a bigger share of income. So today we're going to see the implications that this data has on the Marxist theory of exploitation, and we're going to look at further evidence that suggests that our model that I'm going to develop here further, that our model is essentially correct. We're also going to be looking at the consequences of inequality and whether those who act as if inequality is not a big deal are right or not. And we're going to present evidence from the Great Depression to suggest that income inequality, that wealth inequality is not a right outcome, is pretty unhealthy for the economy as a whole. Then we're going to debate whether equality is or is not the pathway to go, the right step. Our conclusion is therefore going to be a summary of everything we've exposed so far. So let's begin by explaining what exploitation actually is, how it manifests itself, and how it yields the different outcomes that we have seen with respect to inequality. And for that, I have decided to create some notes so that I can make the points more clear. So let's begin first by defining what capital actually is, since this is the main component of the explanation of inequality and of exploitation that we're going to give here. And capital for Marx is actually not a thing. It's not something that you can just point to. It's actually a process. It's a process that essentially is characterized by this fluctuation of money and commodities that is described, as you can see in the notes, in this succession of M to C to M prime. Now, M is the initial investment, the initial quantity of money that the capitalist puts into the purchase of two main components, which are constant capital and variable capital. Now, constant capital are essentially the means of production, the tools, the equipment required to produce something. And Marx calls it constant because these elements, these means of production, do not generate more value than the value that they already have, since they can just transmit their own value into the commodity. However, and in contrast with this constant capital, there's a variable capital, which Marx uses to describe the initial investment in the wages of productive workers since it is productive workers. And this distinction is also very important, the distinction between productive and unproductive labor, because there is essentially one form of labor that generates value, which is the one that is whose wages are essentially exchanged against capital, against variable capital, whether the unproductive labor is the one whose wages are exchanged against revenue. This is why Adam Smith, for example, said that a servant is going to make you poor, whereas some productive labor is going to make you rich, because one form of labor produces value that you can extract some surplus from, whereas the other one doesn't, just takes from that surplus value created. It doesn't mean that the unproductive workers are not necessary. It just means that they do not produce this value. So when speaking out variable capital, we must define that this is only the wages of productive laborers. So in this process, once means of production and labor are combined together, we get a product that is essentially a commodity or a set of commodities of some sort. And this commodity is exchanged in the market for a certain quantity of money, which is going to be M prime. Now, here Marx said that there's some mysterious element because this M prime is essentially bigger. Ideally, it's essentially bigger than the initial investment, M. And so there's something in the production process itself, not in the exchange of the commodity for M prime, since that exchange is an equal exchange. The commodity in the market is exchanged exactly for the value that it has. So there's no unequal exchange there. But we've seen that M prime is greater than M. Thus, in the production of C, there has to be some element that has generated extra value, which we're going to argue is the productive laborers themselves, whose wages were advanced before in the form of variable capital. So we can then say that variable capital is essentially the same as the wages of productive workers, which is also the same as the necessary value to reproduce the labor power of those productive workers. Now, this necessary value varies in between industries, in between countries, in between different periods of time, since the labor power of a Chinese worker requires probably less necessary value to be reproduced than that of an American worker. So we can then say that surplus value is essentially an extension of that necessary value, since those productive workers need not produce that extra value due to the fact that the necessary value is already what they need to exist and reproduce. And that surplus value here is assumed is not appropriated by the workers, by the productive workers themselves. It is distributed amongst different elements, a part of which comes in the form of profit for the capitalist class. So now that we know what surplus value is and that it comes from an extension of the labor of productive workers further than the amount of labor time that they need in order to reproduce their labor power, we now get to the main point here, which is what is exploitation and how do we measure it? So we previously said that exploitation is essentially the appropriation of the surplus value that we just saw is created by productive workers. And how do we measure it? Well, one of the approximations we have to this is what in Marxist economics is called the rate of surplus value, which here we will denote as E. And E is essentially a ratio between the proportion of surplus value to the total value generated by productive workers and the proportion of the necessary value to the total value. Here it is shown as this division of surplus value over total value over necessary value over total value, and since the denominator of both proportions is essentially the same, we cancel out this denominator and we get that E is the ratio between surplus value and necessary value. Now, E is essentially the rate of surplus value, but as Marx already noted in volume 3 of Das Kapital, this E is essentially an exact expression of the degree of labor exploitation by capital at a given time. And here I want you to note that the total value generated by the workers is essentially the value that they need in order to reproduce their labor power, plus some surplus that they also generate. And it is also important to notice that this rate of surplus value, this degree of exploitation, it's not the same as what here I denote as P, which is the profit rate, which is also the ratio between profits and the total capital employed by the capitalist. Also notice that E is different from the ratio of profit to wages that some economists mistake for the rate of exploitation, since surplus value is always going to be greater than profit. So now that we have an outline for a mathematical model on exploitation, let's put our model into empirical testing as well as its predictions to see whether this model matches or not the real world. And for this, I want to show you the following graph, which represents the estimates of the rate of surplus value from 1964 till 2001. And before we begin interpreting the data, I want to explain that these two graphs that you can see represent two different measurements. One, which is the ST, comes from Shaikh and Tonak, two economists who started this measurement, and the other one comes from Simon Mohun, another economist, who made some improvements to the model and came up with a different measurement, which shows even clearly what we want to explain here. So, as we can see, during the decade of 1960 and the decade of 1970, the rate of exploitation, which is the same as the rate of surplus value, essentially was stagnant, with some peaks, but essentially stagnant. However, from the 1980s onward, this one has only grown exponentially. And to see why this is the case, allow me to show once again the other graph that we already saw in our last video, where we see how the union membership and income inequality are related in the United States. The measurements for the degree of exploitation that I showed before are also from the United States, which is the country that we are focusing on right now. And let's see how, for example, during the 60s and 70s, the income of the top 1%, essentially formed by the capitalist class, the income share was essentially stagnant, the same that we saw the rate of exploitation. And now, from the 1980s onward, we see an exponential increase in the share of income, which is also followed by an exponential decrease in US union membership. Now, this clearly shows that our model is right, since exploitation is greater whenever workers have less power and whenever capital is not constricted as much. We also see how the top 1% sees their income share increase exponentially as the rate of exploitation increases exponentially. And this is not only the case for the United States, since this has been happening throughout the entire capitalist world, as we can see in the following graph, which is in Spanish, but it's easy to understand because it essentially gives a measurement for the rate of exploitation in the entire capitalist world from 1973 onwards until 2013. And here in this graph, we can clearly see how throughout the entire world, the rate of exploitation has been increasing ever since the 1980s. And this increasing rate of exploitation is highly related to the increase in income inequality, since, as we can see in the following graphs, it follows that income inequality measured by the Gini coefficient in the United States has immensely increased from the 1970s, 1980s onward, thus proving the idea that inequality in modern capitalist societies is not a matter of natural biological differences amongst ethnicities, amongst individuals, amongst genders, is actually a product of the state of the economy at a given time. And this is what individuals like Jordan Peterson fail to understand. They ignore this component, this social component, this economic component of inequality, because for them it becomes a lot more easy to justify the current mode of production by ignoring the actual state of affairs. They are not doing science there. They're idealizing a certain state of affairs, and they are not giving us the entire picture, which is the one that we're giving right now here. But our job is not done still, because even though we now know that there is a correlation between surplus value extraction and income inequality, and that there is an inverse correlation between the amount of bargaining power of workers and the amount of exploitation that it's done to them, we still need to show exactly how this exploitation is done. We still need to see some more evidence that suggests that this is the case, and we specifically have to show how it is that in modern times workers can be exploited to a further degree. And to do this, I want to explain essentially two main more concepts, which are the two different forms of extraction of surplus value that exist in capitalist societies, which are essentially the extraction of relative surplus value and of absolute surplus value. And so a capitalist that wants to increase their profits by extracting more surplus value can do it in one of these two forms. If they choose the method of absolute surplus value, they will be increasing the intensity of the working time or the time of work itself. They will be lengthening the working hours, or they will be intensifying the labor of the workers, as we can see in this figure, where through the production of absolute surplus value, the amount of surplus value, which here is denoted as S, increases as you increase the amount of hours that the worker has to work, where before they worked 10, now they work 11, or by intensifying this amount of production of surplus value, so that when a worker before could produce some surplus value in 10 hours, now he produces the same amount that he would produce in 11 hours, only that in 10. This, of course, will be appropriated by the capitalist as well. But the amount of absolute surplus value that can be extracted essentially faces some physical limits, since there's only 24 hours a day for a worker to be employing their labor in, and there's only so much a worker can do. However, there is an even more efficient manner of extracting surplus value, which is that of the production of relative surplus value. And this one entails the change in productivity by means of employing more and better technology, or by means of dividing labor in a more efficient manner, of organizing labor in a more productive fashion. As we can appreciate in the figure here, before there is any technical change, a worker produces 5 hours a day for their own reproduction of their labor power, and another 5 hours of the day for the creation of surplus value. However, after this technical change is done, surplus value now occupies a portion of the value that before was the necessary value. Whereas before the worker had to work 5 hours, now the worker needs to work for the reproduction of their labor power 4 hours. And surplus value is expanded since there's a depreciation of the value of labor done by this technical change. Now here I argue that this form of extraction of surplus value, meaning relative surplus value, is the one that prevails in modern capitalist societies, and is the one that explains essentially the increasing levels of inequality that we see, especially after the 1980s. But how can we prove this? Well, if we want to show that this is the case, we would need to see a linear increase in the productivity of labor and an stagnation of the wages of productive workers, or even a decrease in the wages of productive workers. Now, is this the case or not? Well, As the data shows, this is clearly the case, since the data shows that productivity has indeed been rising linearly for the last centuries, and how, however, the real compensation per production worker, which is adjusted to inflation based on the consumer price index, has been stagnant ever since the late 1970s, early 1980s. This date also coincides with the date that we have given for the exponential increase in the rate of surplus value, as well as on the exponential increase in economic inequality, whether you measure it by income or by wealth. And this is not the only measurement that we have for the stagnation of the wages of workers, since, for example, here we see how the changes in labor shares in the G20 countries, which represent the major capitalist countries that we're looking at from 1970 to 2014, are essentially negative. And Spain has the worst data of them all, since workers have experienced the biggest decrease in their shares. This pattern is also repeated in the United States if we look at the compensation of employees, which measures the ratio of wages and salary accruals to gross domestic product. We see a clear exponential decrease in this ratio, indicating that gross domestic product has been increasing at a greater path than wages, or that wages have actually been decreasing. All of this conclusively proves our idea that exploitation is the main source of the wealth of the capitalist class, as well as of the inequality that exists in capitalist societies. But I'm not going to be so simplistic and claim that this is the only source of inequality, since I'm very well aware that there's other sources of inequality. For example, unemployment plays a key role in inequality as well, especially because it's related as well to exploitation, since when there's high unemployment, workers are willing to sell their labor power at a lower value due to the fact that it is more complicated for them to find a job, thus allowing for the capitalists to extract more surplus value. But we also admit that inequality comes from the natural differences in between individuals, since some individuals are taller, some individuals are stronger, some individuals are simply smarter. But the differences between individuals alone cannot explain this situation that we see of exacerbated inequality, because human beings by definition belong to the same race and thus cannot be so different as to explain only through these natural capacities of each one of them the inequalities that we see today. The vast majority, therefore, of the inequality that we see today is a social product, is a product of the economic basis of our society, is a product of the contradictions of capital, and, as we will see now, is the generator of deep crises that ultimately harm the entire economy. So now that we have presented the vast majority of this exposition, it is now time to move to one of the conclusive points, which is that of whether inequality is or is not a good outcome. And to begin answering this question, I want to first criticize two main approaches that I've heard being made by individuals who subscribe or who defend the Austrian School of Economics. The first one is essentially that inequality is something good and it's something we should not worry about, since it guarantees that those at the top are the most productive and the most efficient ones, and it also incentivizes those at the bottom to become better and to compete with a better incentive. And this approach is actually difficult to criticize because it is very easy to agree with this point, and I in fact agree with this point. I do hold the belief that some form of inequality has to exist because people need some incentive, need to see that there is a goal to reach. It's not like Marxists want equality, which is something that we're going to discuss in the next point, but we don't really argue for equality. However, the ones that make this argument, especially the ones that are trying to justify our current mode of production by doing so, ignore the fact that the levels of inequality we see today do not, in fact, represent this hierarchy of competence. And they do not represent this hierarchy of competence because, as we have seen, the source of this inequality is exploitation. Furthermore, even if we could associate some traits of competitiveness to the higher class, this would not be something inherent and natural that they have, since competence does not develop the second you are born, does not develop genetically, but rather is something that develops socially. Engineers are not born engineers, they become engineers through social interactions. The same goes for the capitalist class. What this means is, of course, that those who start from a superior position, who have more opportunities, are the ones who are going to end up being more intelligent and more highly educated. But does this mean that it is fair that they can exploit the labor of other people? Does this mean that it is fair that they get a head start? That the system is rigged towards benefiting them? No, it clearly doesn't. This argument only justifies those societies where competence actually reflects the levels of inequality and where inequality is not as high as it is today, because by definition human beings are not so different so as to produce these high inequalities only through natural means. Furthermore, the working class and those at the bottom have actually been doing worse during the last decades, so it's clear that inequality is not making them any better off. Sure, they are now more productive than before, but they are not receiving the full amount of that which they produce. Thus, we can make the conclusion that this argument does not justify the current mode of production. It would only justify some ideal scenario where everyone receives the full amount of whatever they produce. The second argument that I have heard is that inequality is good so long as the bottom part is doing okay, has a decent life, and they earn a decent amount of money. And this one is problematic, first of all, because it actually doesn't represent the real capitalist world today, because as we just saw, the bottom part and the working class are doing worse from the last decades onwards, but also because it just focuses on relative living standards and on the money that people earn, and it forgets about the relationships of production and the relationships of power that are at the core of the contradictions in capitalism. This argument would be essentially the same that someone trying to justify slavery would make by saying that, well, if slaves are fed properly, have decent living standards, and they have some level of freedom, it's okay for slavery to exist. And this is clearly not something that justifies slavery, because it doesn't take into consideration the fact that the relationship of production, the relationship of power in slavery is essentially an unjust and exploitative one. And the same goes for capitalism. We just saw that capitalism puts some people in a position where they can exploit the labor of other individuals. And no matter how good the ones exploited do, even if they were doing relatively good, as in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, this would still not justify the capitalist mode of production, because it is still true that the source of the wealth of capitalist nations is the workers that are exploited. And the fact that this relationship of power and relationship of production exists only that in the background means that at some point, at whatever point, things can turn around and the workers can immediately see lower living standards, which is what happened essentially after the 1970s, after the 1980s. So even though these circumstances might be beneficial in the short run, they do not create a sustainable long-term effect. So we can then say that this second argument is flawed essentially because it doesn't represent the actual state of affairs, and because even if it did, even if it were the case that workers are seeing rising living standards, exponentially rising living standards, it would still ignore the fact that the relationship of power hasn't been altered, that those who own the means of production are still the capitalist class. And power doesn't just stay at the production level, it reaches other parts of the society, like the political institutions, for example, which is why current bourgeois democracies are so flawed, because they are essentially ruled undercover by the bourgeoisie. In contrast to these two arguments, I want to make the case that inequality, especially the levels of inequality that capitalism produces, are not beneficial even for capitalist societies themselves. And to justify my position, I want to introduce another economic model, which is that of the aggregate supply and aggregate demand, so that we can use it to see previous experiences of high levels of inequality and what they have yielded in terms of economic output. This model has some more math than the one that I presented earlier, but it is quite simple algebra, so I think that we can all follow through. I don't want the presentation of this model to be too long or boring, so I have decided to condense all of it on some notes to give you an idea of how we actually compute this aggregate demand and aggregate supply, so that we can see what the effects of inequality are in this framework. But before we begin by deriving the aggregate demand, I want to show first the basis of the aggregate demand, which is the basic IS-MP model, where the IS is essentially a curve that gives us an illustration of the inverse relationship that exists between the real interest rate, here denoted by R, and short-run output, which is denoted by this Y with two dots on top. And we must note that Y is short-run output, which is essentially the percentage deviation from the trend, where Y at a given year T is essentially the actual output that exists at that year in the entire economy, and Y prime is the long run trend that is derived using other models. And the MP, which essentially stands for monetary policy, well, tells us the decision of the real interest rate that the central bank of a country makes. Now, the central bank does not directly influence the real interest rate, but it is theorized that it can do so by controlling the nominal interest rate, which it does have some direct power over. Let's remember that the real interest rate is the interest rate adjusted to inflation, whereas the nominal is not adjusted to inflation. And to derive the IS curve, we begin by presenting the national identity formula, which is the formula for GDP or output at some year, which you might be familiar with if you have taken courses in economics previously. This identity tells us essentially that the uses of the resources of a society essentially are equal to the total resources that that society possesses. And so we continue by defining each one of the variables here, which are C at time t, which essentially stands for consumption, I at time t, which stands for investment, G at time t, which stands for government consumption, X at time t, which essentially means the exports, and IM at time t, which tells us the imports that have been made in that society. We subtract imports from the equation because imports is something that a society pays for, is something that it subtracts from everything that it has produced. And by defining each one of these variables, we're essentially saying that they represent a certain percentage, a certain portion of the total long-run output. For example, consumption is the total output times a certain percentage that goes to consumption. The same goes for government expenditure, for exports, imports, and to define investment, we have made this ratio between investment and the long-run output trend to mean essentially the percentage that goes to investment minus the difference between the real interest rate and small r, which here represents the marginal product of capital. Now let's remember that in the short run, these two need not be equal. However, in the long run, the real interest rate must be equal to marginal product of capital. B in this equation is a parameter, essentially. And so to solve this model, we essentially substitute these 5 equations into the original one, and we get this very messy equation that we're now going to organize to make it mean something. And so to do this, we first divide both sides by the long run output trend, and we subtract 1 from each side so that we can get something that looks like the short run output trend that we just saw is the percentage deviation from the actual long run trend. And by doing so, we essentially make this one a little bit more intelligible, and we also put them all the we put all the A parameters together and we subtract one from all of them, and we call that a single parameter A with the two dots on top. And so we get the solution that short-run output is essentially going to be equal to the A parameter minus the deviation of the interest rate from marginal productivity of capital times the B parameter. Thus, we see here that output is negatively related to the real interest rate. And so now we can derive the aggregate demand curve by essentially drawing on the ISMP framework that we have shown. We first give an algebraic definition for a simple monetary policy rule, which is essentially going to say that the difference between the real interest rate and the marginal productivity of capital is going to be equal to some parameter M, which essentially measures the responsiveness of the government to deviations from the target of inflation, times the difference between pi and pi prime, where pi is going to be the actual inflation level at a given time, and pi prime is going to be the target of inflation. So we mix the IS curve with the simple monetary policy rule, and by doing some algebra, we get to this idea that the short-run output is going to be equal to the A parameter, that is still the same as the one that it was in the IS curve, minus the B parameter times the M parameter times the difference of inflation from the target that the central bank wants to impose. And here I want you to notice that the aggregate demand curve is not a market curve. It is not downward sloping because of decreasing marginal utility, like what neoclassical economists say for market curves, but it's actually downward sloping because whenever the price level increases at a given time, the Federal Reserve or the central bank of any other capitalist country will tend to work for a higher real interest rate that will end up leading to a decrease in investment and thus to a decrease in the short-run level of output. So to finish off this model, we just have to show the aggregate supply curve that we argue is the same as the Phillips curve, which gives us a relationship between the price level, between inflation and short-run output. And I have heard some very good criticisms to the Phillips curve made by Marxist or heterodox economists like Anwar Shaikh, but this curve does actually work under certain circumstances, and it is not as important as the aggregate demand, so we're just going to present it and leave it in the background. So essentially the Phillips curve tells us that there is a direct relationship between what here I denote as #pi, which is the increment in the inflation rate, and short-run output. And essentially the equation is the following. We have that the increment in the inflation level is essentially equal to some V parameter times short-run output plus an O parameter, which gives us external shocks like an increase or a decrease in oil prices. Here we define the increment in the price level as the difference between the price level at time t and the price level at time t minus 1, since it is argued that the price level at t minus 1 is going to be the expected price level for the future. And so if we graph these two curves, we essentially get a model that looks like the one in the screen right now, where aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersect at a given level of output and a given level of inflation. And so at the steady state, short-run output is 0, meaning that it is at the same level at which the long-run trend is. However, during a depression, short-run output would be lower than 0, thus being negative. And so now that we have this model, let's see what happened during the Great Depression to examine whether inequality leads to good outcomes or not. And so as we have seen in the aggregate demand curve, consumption and investment are part of the A parameter, which affects to the model by shifting, whether to the right or to the left of the graphical representation, the aggregate demand curve. Thus, if there were to be a decrease in investment and consumption, we expect to see a shift towards the left of the aggregate demand curve to levels of output that are below zero. And so now we know that the Great Depression was characterized by a shift towards the left of the aggregate demand curve, essentially brought about by a decrease in consumption and investment. And here we argue that one of the main factors behind this decrease in consumption and investment was the inequality that characterized the United States economy amongst all other capitalist economies during the years previous to the Wall Street crash. And I am making the case that this decrease in consumption and investment was essentially due to the high levels of inequality of that period, because it was the case that most of the consumption and spending was done by the top 30%, since essentially the 70% left was considered as poor. And most of the consumption and spending that was being done at the time, especially in the lower classes, was done through debt, through going into massive amounts of debt. Here in this figure, we see that the data shows us that exactly this was the case, because by 1929, the year of the Wall Street crash, the top 10% in the United States own close to 50% of the total wealth. And when the Wall Street crash came, it essentially affected these top earners. It affected the top 30%, the top 10%. So, taking into consideration the fact that it was these people who were doing most investment and consumption at the time, when they were affected by this crash, the instability and the uncertainty provoked by it produced a decrease in this consumption and investment that ultimately led to a real economic catastrophe. And we know how bad the Great Depression was. We know about the high levels of unemployment, we know about the suicides, and we know essentially about the great catastrophe that it meant for the entire United States and European societies. So we saw massively high amounts of debt and massively high amounts of income inequality that, motivated by the Wall Street crash, led to an economic catastrophe. And these levels of inequality were produced by capitalism. So here we are in a contradiction, because capitalism, if left alone, produces these massively high levels of inequality that themselves are dangerous and harmful for the capitalist economies. So capitalism is definitely not a sustainable mode of production. And the effect that the shift in the aggregate demand had on the US economy is very well represented in this graph, where we see how, in response to this shift in aggregate demand, there was also a shift in the short-run aggregate supply that led not only to a situation where there's less output, where there's negative short-run output, but also where there's deflation, where there's a lower level of prices. What is the definition essentially of depression? And here, the horizontal black line is the long-run aggregate supply, which essentially is theorized to give a fixed amount of real GDP for each level of prices. Capitalism essentially contains in its material basis a set of contradictions that lead to its downturn, that lead to its destruction. Because, as we can see, capitalism creates levels of inequality that are not sustainable, even for capitalist societies. And the worst thing about this is that inequality keeps appearing in capitalist societies, like before 2008, where we see immense levels of inequality as well that are also related to the economic catastrophe of the Great Recession. And today, we also see massive levels of inequality mixed with massive levels of debt, which is not good if we take into consideration what has happened previously under similar circumstances. Capitalism is essentially leading us to another economic catastrophe that we cannot avoid within the capitalist framework. So there is no argument to justify this. There is no argument to justify that capitalism is self-contradictory, that capitalism leads to its own destruction by creating these conditions for it. Inequality in capitalism is therefore not good, because it leads to an uneven distribution of power that is then met by an increase in the poor performance of political institutions, etc., but also because it leads to economic catastrophes. And so the question now becomes, is equality the solution to this? Should we reach maximum equality in order to get rid of this problem? And my answer to this is a clear no, because as we have seen, the problem is not inequality per se. The problem is essentially the inequality that arises from the exploitation of the labor of other people, as well as the inequality that increases so exponentially that it reaches levels that are out of our control and that will lead to disastrous consequences. And Marxists have always been very critical of equality since it is an ideal. It is not a material element that we can actually get to. It's just a simple utopia. You cannot have complete equality. Instead of pursuing utopias like equality, for Marxists, it has always been more productive to follow material, tangible things such as getting rid of the domination of capital. We therefore cannot reach equality, but we can reach goals like collectivizing the means of production. We must make the production and reproduction of our social life a collective effort instead of a matter of equality or a matter of profit, because it is demonstrable that whenever people are more free and can benefit to a further degree from their own labor as a product of a societal collective effort, people live better and societies prosper a lot more. So to conclude, we have seen that inequality is a very dense and complex topic that needs to be understood more profoundly, and that essentially needs to be understood through a scientific materialist lens, since those approaches that try to make it something unimportant or that try to reduce it to simple biological differences fail as an explanation for inequality. We have therefore seen that inequality is a product of society, is a product of the way in which people relate to each other, especially in the realm of economics, in the realm of the reproduction and production of the means of subsistence. And we have understood that capitalism creates a level of inequalities that are unsustainable because they lead to a decrease in aggregate demand that can put the economy on a very serious situation. And it also cripples the alternatives within capitalism of solving the problems of capitalism. For example, we all know that we need to take immediate action with respect to climate change, but why are politicians so unable to make this happen? Why are politicians so unable to get to an agreement and to put an end to this serious crisis that we're facing? Well, essentially, this is due to the fact that the profit matter prevails over other matters. And this is not something natural. This is something that our society, the laws that govern our society, force us to do, to take into consideration profit more than other things such as our own survival. So instead of ignoring the problem and pretending that inequality is not bad or that it's actually good, we should be focusing more on what the sources of inequality are and how we can come about improving this situation by essentially changing our mode of production. Capitalism is not sustainable, and what we have seen in this video is just an initiation to the understanding of why it is not. We haven't even covered most of the elements that make capitalism into an unsustainable system, but inequality is clearly one of those. In next videos, I will be developing more some of these ideas that we have seen today, plus some that we will see in the future, but I think that for now, we are good. So please leave any suggestions if you have them, leave any ideas you may have about things that you want to see, etc. And well, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.